Hello there, I'm George Hall, and welcome to another episode of the Good Growth Podcast. I'm joined today by CEO of LK Bennett and Chairman of Good Growth, Darren Topp. As previous listeners will know, this isn't Darren's first time on the Good Growth Podcast, and it's actually a previous appearance that we're here to discuss. But firstly, Darren, thank you very much for joining us. How are you?
I'm very well, George. Thank you for having me on again. I'm a little nervous and tentative about what I predicted a year ago, so let's see. I can't remember now.
Perfect. Well, as we both alluded to there, it's a previous appearance on the podcast that we're here to discuss, and in particular one from the start of this year. So in January 2022, Darren joined our previous host, Dan Kendall, and also Global Operations Director at FatFace, Mark Wright, where some predictions were made by Darren and Mark as to what 2022 would look like for businesses and consumers. Darren, you said then you remember doing that podcast. Do you remember what your predictions were?
Oh, don't. What is good, though, is Mark and I are still in work.
This is true, so it can't have been that bad, right?
So it couldn't have been completely useless.
Well, it seems a bit of a cop-out to use the word unprecedented, as it seems to be the buzzword of the decade. But 2022 hasn't been without its unprecedented moments, despite a return to some more normality in the last couple of years. Darren, firstly, how's 2022 been for you, and how has it been for LK Bennett?
So, it's really been a year of two halves in a way, to use a football analogy during the World Cup. So for LK Bennett in particular, we had a very strong first half, in part, George, because of the pent-up demand for weddings and events that had not occurred during COVID.
Sure.
Which meant that, people rushed back and bought new dresses and new outfits and new shoes for weddings, which were now taking place during the week and not just at the weekends. And Ascot was back and Henley was back and the whole thing. So we had a very, very strong summer. And that is despite some really difficult supply chain challenges across the industry, clearly brought about with the terrible war in Ukraine.
Sure.
So that, on one side, we had some very strong demand side driven sales. Mm-hmm. And on the other side, we did have, challenges around cost base and supply. Now, we're fortunate in one sense that 3/4 of all our products are made in Europe.
Okay.
So it's not being shipped all over the world, which was one of the challenges around getting containers and various other things. But clearly we've had the same challenges around costs, which I'm sure we'll come on to. So we had a very strong first half. And then the second half has been much more a combination of moving into normal trading and then really the cost of living starting to bite, which is what we've seen, I think, across the industry in the last 2 or 3 months.
Yeah, absolutely.
And, clearly certain retailers have found that pinch sharper than others, but it's definitely there. And, the consumer is, she's strapped because she's got pressures on her, limited funds from all different kind of areas, not least of which eating, food, etc. Sure. That puts everything else under pressure.
Sure. Well, that feeds quite nicely into the first prediction. So Darren, cast your mind back to the start of this year. You made 4 predictions. I've gone back and counted them. And I know sometimes mapping out the next month can be tricky, let alone the next 12. But they are quite interesting to reflect on. So at the start of this year in January, you said you felt optimistic and fairly confident at the start of the year looking forward. Obviously, it's tricky to predict world events that are totally out of our control. It sounds like a few good things have come to fruition. Was that confidence justified?
Well, we are going to have had our best year for probably a decade.
Congratulations.
From a profitability point of view. So in that sense, it's been very good. Now, I think what we would acknowledge, and I will be acknowledging when we deliver our results early next year, is that the pent-up demand has flattered the profitability of the business.
Okay.
So I was feeling very confident, very optimistic, and that came to fruition. Now that, as I say, that early optimism has sort of sadly fallen away
for
the challenge that is the cost of living crisis. So it's been a real roller coaster this year, because I think we all thought coming out of COVID in the early part of the year that we would get to some kind of normality.
Right.
And, there was some good indicators there with relatively full employment. There was some supply chain challenges, but it looked like they were starting to unlock. And all of a sudden, sadly, the war in Ukraine has created lots of other different difficulties that I think nobody really predicted at the time. So I suppose the first one I got, I was on the money really.
Yeah.
So we did have a good year.
I'll give you that one. Well, we're 1 for 1. So if you want to just call it quits there and stop the recording.
I think we should call it quits at that. I think that'd be ideal.
Well, one of the other things you mentioned was that it would be a good year for British brands, given the esteem and the reputation that being a British brand has overseas. Has that played out as you expected it to?
It's probably not been as strong as we'd originally anticipated.
Okay.
In part because of some of the supply chain issues, in part because some of the cost of living crisis, is not unique to the UK. It's just as prevalent around the world.
Yeah.
Lots of people lost a big market in Russia. Lots of people lost that. That was a reason. It wasn't a big market for me. I didn't have any supply there.
Okay.
But for many, it was a big market.
Yeah.
I still maintain that this British brands have a unique place around the world.
Interesting.
And people associate them with quality, integrity, and heritage, which they value greatly. And given the challenges that we're going to have in the UK, it's going to be more and more important for those brands to be able to exploit the international element
definitely.
Of their business, because I think we're all going to find the UK market challenging in the next 12 months.
And it looks like it's going to be a good year, a good 2023 for luxury fashion and luxury retail.
I think so. And again, I think that's a byproduct of, coming out of lockdown and people wanting again to be seen and out and about. And, that's had a profound impact on our business in the early part of this financial year for sure.
Sure.
And you've seen, some of the profits of those businesses being very strong for this year.
Yeah.
But you don't have to look far to see some of the challenges that we've already had in 2022 as we come to the back end of it. And people like Jules and Made.com, I mean, these are good businesses.
Yeah.
These are not, they're not built on sand, these businesses, but they're good, strong businesses with good, strong management teams. And unfortunately, the economic circumstances have meant that, they've found it unable to continue to operate profitably. And yes, they may well manifest themselves in a different guise in the coming months, but for all intents and purposes, they're going to be significantly reduced, whatever their new incarnation looks like.
Of course.
And unfortunately, I think that's probably an indicator of what we're likely to see as we go into 23.
In terms of more companies going under?
For sure. I think the more companies are going to either go through some kind of process, whether it's a CVA or an administration. And I just cannot see 23 being anything other than a very, very difficult year for many.
Oh, blimey.
And, for those that have got no balance sheet strength, they're really in trouble, even the good ones. And the problem is, retail's been challenging in lots of ways for the last decade or two.
Sure.
But I think this particular set of challenges is going to be very difficult, and partly because some of the idiosyncrasies of what's going on mean that it doesn't conform to the norms. But it's going to be a challenging time for sure.
And then taking a step back from the economic, the financial lens, your final two predictions were more people focused. So you mentioned at the start of this year that your view on working from home had changed. You now saw it as a force for good and a real asset to employees and businesses. Is that still the case?
I think so, and I think we're now operating in a way where we're trying to find the balance, and I'm not sure we've found that final balance yet. But the reality is, I think working from home is here to stay. Yeah. I think it's here to stay long term. I think the dynamics of the workplace and the workforce have changed, and people not only expect it but demand it. It's meant people can live further afield
Mm-hmm.
because they're not traveling in on a daily basis. And so we found that it's worked very effectively for us as an organization.
Good.
We don't have to have such a larger head office
Sure.
to accommodate everybody. So there's lots. So there's benefits for the business. There's benefits for the individuals.
For both, yeah.
Now there are some downsides to it, and we're starting to understand those. So, for example, onboarding new employees, more junior members of the team being exposed to more senior people. It would often happen by
naturally
accident in a office environment, or they would pick up on things that were going on, or they'd get exposure just through the day-to-day operation of the business. So that doesn't happen as much. So we got to find ways in which we can fill those gaps in an effective way, because we want people to have, successful and fulfilling careers.
Sure.
And in order to do that, we need to show some flexibility about how we operate and how we work. We've got to think of new ways of doing things and new ways of engaging with our teams. But the reality is, George, is that almost 100% of my employees do some form of working from home stroke working from the office.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned working from home and how employees and prospective candidates sort of expect it as standard for jobs in the current day. At the start of this year, you said that you felt the power dynamic between employees and employers sat firmly with employees, in that, they could demand more and that organisations would have to work harder to motivate and retain their employees. Has that played out as you expected it to this year?
Yeah, I mean, I think the dynamics of the employment market are such that, and rightly, by the way, that I think the power dynamic has been very much in the favour of the employee rather than the employer, to use those terms for now. And the reality is that most board rooms are, a significantly bigger chunk of their time is spent thinking about what they need to do to ensure a happy and constructive workforce than perhaps they did 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago. And that's good, because it's making us all think about, well, what are the kind of things that we need to do?
Yeah.
And they are not all just pay. And that's clear. People's expectation is not just about pay. They expect organizations to behave in a responsible and manner, not just to the employees, but to the environment, to third parties. So, I think it's made for a better working environment. And it's made organizations rethink how they deal with people.
Sure.
And that can only be, in the long term, Josh, that can only be a good thing. So whatever happens with, maybe we will see more unemployment in the next 12, 18, 24 months. But the reality is, the challenge remains for all organizations, recruiting and retaining high quality individuals.
Perfect. Well, we've alluded a few times to feelings towards 2023 and ideas of what might happen. Your 2022 predictions, it feels like they were pretty spot on. So well done on those.
I wasn't a million miles away, I don't think, George.
And then it feels like I'd almost be doing a disservice to any listeners out there by not asking if you've got any overarching expectations or views on the next 12 months. Any thoughts at all?
I genuinely think this is going to be the most difficult year for most people who currently work in retail.
Right.
I think it's going to be super difficult. And the reasons for that are, we're being hit in all sides. So normally when you've got a recession, you normally don't have high inflation.
Okay.
Yeah. And you don't normally have a very tight workforce. In recent years, you've also not had very tight money supply, because it's been one of the tools used by governments to ease the pressure on the economy.
Sure.
So for many people, they've never seen it. They've never experienced the consequences of a recession, and me included, really. And I'm 55. So I'm not just out of university. I've been working a long time.
Yeah.
And there have been, there was the financial crisis, which was in 2008. We had in the early 2000s, we had the property market had a correction or crash, depending on your perspective.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I grew up in the Thatcher government in the north, which had many challenges associated with
I
it.
can imagine.
But I think for a lot of people, we've not had the kind of pressures that people are genuinely feeling now.
No.
And those pressures are only going to get more difficult.
Okay.
And equally, they're not restricted to, you know, traditionally what we might have thought as lower income groups and thought, well, they're the ones that are going to really struggle. You know, I think there's plenty of people struggling or will find it difficult, you know, on 60, 70, 80, 90, £100,000 a year. I think that's for sure. Because, you know, if you work in London and you're on 6-figure salary and you've got yourself, you know, a flat and borrowed £500,000, then you're going to find it tight when you come to remortgaging it. And I get perhaps there's not a lot of sympathy for people who earn those kind of salaries, but the reality is those people are going to be affected as well. So, I mean, I think it's going to be really, really tight. If the majority of your income is spent on housing, whether it's renting or mortgage, eating and food, it just means you've got less and less disposable income.
Sure.
You know, we rely on that disposable income being spent in retail, and there's so many other places to spend it. So I do think, and I think if Jills and Made.com are an indicator of what 23 might be, then I think that basically says it's going to be bloody difficult, to be honest. Now, the one thing I would say about retailers is they are very creative and imaginative, and you know, we will do everything we can to work around this and through it, both supporting our people, supporting suppliers, supporting other stakeholders. But I think we have to acknowledge that there's going to be some blood on the carpet and it's going to be tough. But equally, I think the things we talked about a year ago, so making sure you got the best people, motivating them, you know, all those things are not only just as important, but become more important when the business is more challenged, because it's important that you become more focused.
Sure.
So, you know, retailers have got to be careful they don't buy too much, you know. So there's lots of things that we can do to look to mitigate those headwinds. But those headwinds are going to be turbulent for sure and affect all income groups, I'm afraid to say.
Well, it sounds like a situation where if retailers can make it through 2023, although it won't be plain sailing afterwards by any means, it'll stand them in good stead for whatever comes next.
I think so, because the one thing about and everyone says, oh yeah, but the pandemic, you know, everything was closed. But the one thing I would say about the pandemic is the level of government support, whether, you know, forget whether you think the government did a good job or not, but the level of government support that went to businesses, and that very, very few businesses retail businesses went into any admin process at all during COVID, because the government were paying your employees' salary to a large degree and you were getting the money. You didn't have any rates and you couldn't be evicted from your property. So it meant that, you know, if nothing else, you were able to tread water. Well, suddenly you've got the full weight pretty much next year of full employment costs, full rent, full rates. So it's going to be a challenging time for everybody.
Well, Darren, as always, thank you very much for your time. It's been a pleasure to have you on the show to talk about your insights and views, especially for the year ahead, which sounds quite challenging.
Yeah, there'll be a bit of fun as well. Well, you know, it is work, so you've got to enjoy it. And, you know, if you don't enjoy it, do something else.
Well, exactly. And hopefully some light at the end of the tunnel as well. Darren, thank you very much for your time today.
Thanks, Josh. Take care.